I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen bee.
The palace did not need a speech, a balcony appearance, or a public rebuke to send shock through the royal household. It needed only one removal, one erased name, one revised list sent quietly before dawn. And when Queen Camilla's name disappeared from Catherine's upcoming event schedule, the silence inside the palace became louder than any announcement the monarchy could have made. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine noticed it before anyone spoke. She sat at the briefing table with the revised event schedule in front of her, her eyes moving once across the page, then returning to the same empty space, as if the missing name had made the paper heavier. The event list, the official palace document that tells staff who will attend, arrive, speak, and represent the crown at a public engagement, no longer included Camilla. It did not move her to a different entrance. It did not place her under a reduced role. It removed her completely. Catherine remained listed as the sole senior female royal representative for the engagement, and that single line changed the mood of the room. The aide did not rush to explain. He placed another copy beside Catherine's folder, then stepped back with the careful stillness of someone who knew he was delivering more than paperwork. This event had first been prepared as a joint appearance, a moment designed to show unity between the Princess of Wales and the Queen Consort during a fragile period for the monarchy. That was why it mattered. A shared appearance would have told the country that the women at the center of royal life could stand together. A solo appearance told a very different story. Catherine understood that difference immediately, and she read the list twice, because once was not enough to believe it. Camilla received the news in another room, away from Catherine, away from the aides who had helped shape the original plan. She listened without interrupting, but the blow was clear. The Queen Consort was not being delayed, protected, or spared from a tiring schedule. She was being excluded from a platform that had once included her name. To Camilla, the decision carried the sting of a demotion delivered softly, with polished language and no raised voice. She had spent years learning how palace symbolism worked, and now that symbolism had turned against her, the note attached to the revised list made the truth impossible to ignore. It did not blame illness. It did not cite timing. It described the change as a focused adjustment to Catherine's event structure, which meant the removal had been intentional. The aide set the paper down without adding a word, and the silence did what language could not. Everyone in that room understood that the question was no longer whether Camilla would attend. The real question was far more dangerous. Who now had the power to decide which royal women stood beside Catherine? But before the palace could control the meaning of the erased name, the people behind that name began to understand what had truly been taken. This was never just about an event list. It was about rank, trust, image, and the quiet power that comes from being invited to stand beside the future queen. For Catherine, the change carried responsibility. For Camilla, it carried humiliation. And for Charles, it created the kind of private pain no palace statement could soften. Catherine did not rush to react. She kept the revised schedule in front of her, studying the lines with the careful restraint of someone who understood that a single change could shake an entire household. The engagement had been built around her steadiness after months of palace pressure, whispered disagreements, and uneasy public appearances. Catherine was expected to carry calm into a room still haunted by tension. And that mattered because the monarchy needed her to look certain when everything behind the doors felt uncertain. Her name was not merely written on the page, it was carrying the weight of continuity, trust, and the next chapter of royal authority. Camilla's original place on that list had been designed to send a different message. Her presence beside Catherine would have suggested unity, a careful show that the Queen and the Princess of Wales could stand together without visible strain. A royal engagement list is more than a schedule. It is the palace's formal guide to who appears, in what role, and with what symbolic weight. That is why the removal struck so deeply. It did not simply change who would attend, it changed what the event would mean. Catherine understood that the public would see her standing alone, and the palace would know she had been allowed to do so. Catherine finally asked one question. Not why, not who approved it, not whether it could be changed. She asked whether Camilla had already been told. The room tightened around those words, because they carried both compassion and caution. Catherine knew the queen consort would feel the cut personally, yet she also knew that stepping backward now would turn her own role into something negotiable. Her calm was not coldness, it was quiet resolve. She was no longer just protecting an event, she was protecting the meaning of her place within the monarchy. Charles heard the decision from an aide and said nothing. The king did not remain silent because the news was easy to accept. He remained silent because he understood how far the situation had moved beyond simple preference. Camilla's removal had already passed through hands stronger than courtesy. William's influence could be felt in the background, not loud, not theatrical, but firm enough to change the shape of the day. The prince had drawn a line around Catherine's platform, and that line separated her future role from Camilla's reach. Camilla realized it quickly. This was not a logistical adjustment. This was symbolism sharpened into action. Catherine's event was being protected from interference, and the queen consort was being pushed outside the frame of influence. The pain was not only that her name had vanished, the pain was that everyone understood why it had vanished. And the deeper they looked into the silence around Catherine's event, the more one hidden incident began to rise back to the surface. Every palace rupture has a beginning, but the most dangerous ones rarely begin in public. They begin in a corridor, a whispered correction, a look held too long. The removal of Camilla's name did not come from nowhere. It grew from one specific moment, one private ceremonial rehearsal, and one decision that Catherine never forgot. Catherine had already sensed the pressure building before the revised event list ever reached her hands. The silence around her role had become too careful, too polished, too controlled. Behind the palace language of unity, there was another struggle taking shape, and it centered on a fictional rehearsal for the Windsor Women's Service of Remembrance. The service was meant to honor royal women across generations, and in simple terms, a service of remembrance is a formal royal gathering where the family marks memory, duty, and public respect through a carefully planned order. Catherine had been chosen to lead the order of arrival, not as decoration, but as a signal of her growing place in the monarchy's future. Camilla's office changed that balance in one sharp move. Minutes before the rehearsal began, the queen consort's private secretary handed over a revised ceremonial running order, a document that tells each royal where to stand, when to enter, and how the moment should unfold. The new version placed Camilla ahead of Catherine, even though the entire event had been designed around the Princess of Wales. Nothing about it looked accidental. Nothing about it felt harmless. It was a correction made at the last possible moment, when refusing it would look difficult, and accepting it would quietly shrink Catherine's authority. Catherine did not raise her voice. She did not turn the room into a battle. She looked at the revised order, closed the folder slowly, and let that small action speak for her. Those nearby understood the meaning at once. Catherine had seen the move clearly. She had recognized the pressure beneath the politeness. The pain was not only that her place had been altered, the deeper wound was that it had been done under the language of ceremony, as if tradition itself had been used to push her aside. William asked her later what had happened. The prince did not ask with anger first. He asked with concern, because he knew Catherine rarely gave weight to small slights, unless they carried a larger warning. She answered quietly that this was no longer about courtesy. It was about boundaries. That word changed everything. Boundaries meant the issue had moved beyond feelings. Boundaries meant Catherine's role needed protection before another polished adjustment became permanent. William's circle remembered the rehearsal, when Camilla's name vanished from the later event list. What looked like punishment now looked like a deliberate correction. The erased name was not random. It was the answer to the moment Catherine had never forgotten. But corrections inside the monarchy rarely stay polite for long, especially when the person corrected is still wearing a crown. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with a door closing. Catherine, Camilla, William, and Charles entered a private room where no cameras waited and no courtiers could rescue the silence. On the table lay the revised event list. 1 page, 4 names discussed, 1 name removed. And suddenly, royal courtesy had nowhere left to hide. Camilla wanted the answer spoken aloud. She had already understood the meaning of the missing name, but understanding it privately was different from hearing Catherine, William, and Charles face it together. The meeting took place after the Queen Consort requested a direct explanation for her removal from Catherine's engagement, and that mattered, because palace decisions often survive by staying vague. Once the people involved sit in the same room, vagueness begins to crack. A private palace sitting room, in plain terms, is not just a comfortable space. It is where family pain and royal power often meet without the protection of public ceremony. Charles came because Camilla expected him to defend her place. The king knew that expectation before she said a word. He also knew Catherine's role was no longer a simple matter of scheduling, and William had come for that reason. The prince was not there to punish anyone. He was there because Catherine's authority had been pulled into a struggle that could not be settled by soft smiles and careful phrases. Everyone understood the stakes. If Camilla could be removed once without explanation, then Catherine's future position was being protected. But if Camilla forced that explanation into the open, the wound would become impossible to hide. Camilla turned to Catherine and asked whether she had personally approved the removal. The question was direct, but the pain beneath it was even sharper. It placed Catherine in a cruel position. If she said yes, she would seem ruthless. If she said no, she would appear powerless. Catherine held the silence for a moment, then answered with controlled sadness that the event had to remain focused. The words were calm. The impact was brutal. Camilla heard the message beneath them. This engagement would not be shared, adjusted, softened, or used to repair appearances. William then made the connection impossible to deny. He placed the old rehearsal order beside the new event list, turning two separate papers into one unavoidable story. The earlier ceremonial running order, the document that had tried to move Camilla ahead of Catherine during the Windsor Women's Service of Remembrance, now stood as the reason behind the latest decision. Charles looked at both papers and slowly set his glasses down. The king's silence changed. It was no longer confusion, it was recognition. Camilla left first. She did not win the explanation she wanted, and she did not receive the defense she expected. Yet the deeper shock came after the door closed, because Charles did not immediately follow her. He stayed behind with Catherine and William, caught between loyalty to his wife and the cold truth of the crown. And in that pause between husband and crown, the real power behind the decision finally began to reveal itself. In the monarchy, power is not always shouted from a throne. Sometimes it appears as a changed schedule, a withheld invitation, a name moved from one column to another. The palace removal of Camilla's name carried the force of an order, but the question haunting every corridor was simple: whose authority had been strong enough to make it happen? William understood the question before anyone dared ask it. He had watched the confrontation leave Charles caught between marriage and monarchy, and he knew the next move could not look emotional. It had to look controlled. The decision had come through a private review by senior palace planners, the officials responsible for shaping Catherine's public program and protecting her long-term royal position. A public program, in simple terms, is the planned series of appearances that tells the country what role a royal is expected to carry. For Catherine, this mattered because her engagements were no longer ordinary duties. They were becoming part of the future reign's identity. The prince read the final event list without triumph. A senior courtier noticed it immediately. William did not smile. He did not look satisfied. He simply exhaled, as if the paper in his hand confirmed a burden he had hoped the family might avoid. That was the quiet force behind the decision. Catherine's work had become too important to be pulled into palace rivalry. Her event could not become a stage for correction, competition, or competing authority. If she was meant to carry steadiness for the monarchy, then the message around her had to remain clean. Catherine felt the cost more sharply than anyone expected. She knew Camilla would not read the removal as protection. The Queen Consort would feel it as rejection, and Catherine understood the human pain inside that. Yet stepping back would have created a different wound. It would have told every office, every aide, and every watcher inside the palace that Catherine's platform could still be adjusted when pressure became uncomfortable. She could not allow that. Not after the rehearsal. Not after the confrontation. Not after Charles had seen both papers and remained silent. The confidential planning note made the truth plain. Catherine had to appear uninterrupted in role and message. Those words carried more weight than any public statement. They meant the palace had decided the event was not just about attendance, it was about authority. Catherine's presence had to stand on its own, without another royal figure beside her pulling attention, changing the tone, or reopening the old struggle. The phrase proved that Camilla's removal was strategic, not accidental, and once strategy entered the room, sympathy had limits. Camilla had spent years understanding palace power, but now that power moved without her. The protective circle had closed around Catherine, and the queen consort was outside it. That was the first real consequence. Not noise, not scandal, exclusion, the coldest kind. And when that consequence reached Camilla's private rooms, the palace discovered that silence could wound more deeply than any public insult. The public saw nothing, no statement, no raised voice, no dramatic exit across the courtyard. But behind a closed door, the emotional fallout began. Camilla sat with the revised list in her hand, staring at the empty space where her name had been. For a woman who understood palace symbolism better than most, the message was impossible to miss. Camilla's office received the final version without softness. There was no replacement role offered, no alternate appearance attached, no carefully balanced duty to make the removal look harmless. Catherine's event program had been completed, and the queen consort was no longer part of it. An event program, in simple terms, is the full palace plan for who attends, how the engagement is explained, and what message the public is meant to receive. That was why this hurt. Camilla had not only lost a place at Catherine's side, she had been removed from the meaning of the day itself. Palace staff moved quickly after the decision. Briefing notes were prepared without Camilla's name. Arrival details were adjusted without her office. Press language was sharpened around Catherine alone, as if the engagement had always been designed that way. That smoothness became the cruelest part. The palace did not stumble after cutting Camilla out. It became calmer. The plan became cleaner. The machine moved forward without hesitation, and that told the queen consort something no aide needed to say. They had prepared for this. They had imagined the event without her before she was officially removed. Camilla read the document alone and placed it face down on a side table. She did not need to tear it, question it, or summon anyone back into the room. The wound was quieter than that. She understood that Catherine's circle had closed, and she was standing outside it. For years, Camilla had survived by mastering the language of palace patience, waiting for acceptance to harden into authority. Now that same palace language had turned cold. No open insult, no public rejection, just absence, polished until it looked official. Charles entered later and found her composed but distant. The king knew anger when he saw it, but this was worse than anger. Camilla's calm made the distance between them sharper, because it left Charles with nothing simple to answer. He could not undo the decision without challenging Catherine's protection. He could not defend the decision without deepening Camilla's humiliation. So he stood in the silence created by both women, one rising into protected authority, the other learning how quickly influence can narrow. Catherine's team moved ahead with unusual calm. Aides who had once checked every phrase twice now worked with quiet certainty, as if the final barrier had been removed. The engagement was becoming simpler, stronger, and more centered around Catherine's role. That success carried its own sadness, because it proved the palace could function more smoothly after excluding Camilla. William noticed the change too. Catherine felt it before he spoke. The issue had moved beyond management, beyond lists, beyond one painful removal. It had become personal, and once it became personal, the future could no longer be defended from behind palace doors alone. Because beyond the lists, titles, and schedules, two people now had to decide what kind of future they were willing to defend. The turning point came without witnesses, no aides, no advisors, no carefully written palace language, just Catherine and William in a private room after the confrontation, facing the emotional weight of what had been done. The removal of Camilla's name had protected Catherine's event, but it had also crossed a royal line that could never be uncrossed. Catherine felt the silence differently now. It no longer belonged to palace officials, event planners, or senior aides. It belonged to her and William, and that made it harder to avoid. The list had been finalized. Camilla was out. Catherine was in alone. Yet victory did not feel clean, because the Princess of Wales understood that every protected role inside the monarchy comes with a private cost. This mattered because her public work had become more than appearances. Her engagements were becoming a measure of stability, a way for people to see where the future of the crown was quietly gathering strength. William knew the cost before she named it. He had watched Catherine carry pressure without complaint, and he had watched Camilla's office test the edge of that patience. Their conversation turned toward a question neither could ignore. Could the monarchy survive if Catherine's role kept being adjusted around other people's discomfort? The future reign, the period when William would one day become king and Catherine would stand beside him as queen, could not be built on endless compromise. It needed clarity, it needed trust, and above all, it needed Catherine's service to be seen without confusion. Catherine admitted the truth softly. She had never wanted Camilla humiliated. She had not wanted the queen consort to sit with an empty space where her name used to be. But Catherine also refused to let her work be reshaped by another office, another late adjustment, another quiet attempt to change the meaning of her place. The pain in her voice made the decision more powerful, not less. She was not acting from bitterness. She was acting from a hard lesson learned inside the palace. If a boundary is not defended once, it will be tested again. William took her hand and gave the decision its final meaning. The prince told Catherine this had not been about revenge. It was about making sure her service was not diluted, softened, or pulled into someone else's struggle for influence. That sentence settled between them like a promise. Catherine would attend the event with calm confidence, not as someone shielded from conflict, but as someone who had accepted the weight of her own position. William then confirmed what the palace would feel long after this event ended. Future lists would face stricter review. Catherine's platform would not be treated as a shared space for rivalry. The shift was permanent. And when Catherine's name finally stood alone on the program, the missing name beside it became more than an absence. It became a message. And once that message reached the outside world, the palace could no longer pretend the missing name had gone unnoticed. By morning, the palace silence had become a national conversation. The missing name moved from private paper to public meaning, and Britain began reading between the lines. Catherine's event list was no longer a schedule, it was a symbol, and when one front page captured the moment in 5 stark words, the monarchy's private decision became impossible to bury. Catherine's solo appearance changed the story before anyone could control it. The final event list had circulated without Camilla, confirming that the Princess of Wales would attend the high-profile engagement without the Queen consort beside her. That mattered, because royal appearances are never just about who enters a room. They tell the public who carries trust, who holds influence, and who is being placed at the center of the monarchy's message. Catherine had already accepted the weight of appearing alone, but once the public noticed Camilla's absence, the private decision became a national signal. Palace press officers tried to soften the meaning. They described the schedule as focused, streamlined, and centered on Catherine's work. But those careful words could not cover the empty space. A press office, in simple terms, is the palace team that shapes public statements, manages media language, and tries to guide how royal decisions are understood. Yet this time, the language was weaker than the silence. Camilla's missing name carried too much meaning. The public did not need an official explanation to understand that something had shifted inside the royal household. Catherine arrived composed, but the seriousness around her told its own story. She did not look shaken. She did not look triumphant. She carried herself with the calm of someone who knew the moment was larger than the event itself. Observers noticed the stillness in her expression as she stepped forward alone, and that restraint made the message sharper. Catherine was not filling a gap left by Camilla. She was standing in a role the palace had chosen to protect. Success and suffering existed in the same breath. Catherine gained clarity, while Camilla's absence became the wound everyone discussed. Camilla remained away from the engagement, and that absence became more powerful than any statement she could have released. If she had spoken, the palace could have answered. If she had appeared elsewhere, the story might have split. But silence kept the focus exactly where the decision had placed it, on Catherine alone. The queen consort's absence did not fade into the background. It grew heavier with every mention, every replay, every careful sentence, from commentators trying not to say too much while saying everything. A London newspaper captured the public mood with brutal simplicity. Its front page showed Catherine walking alone beneath the headline, "Catherine stands alone." Those 5 words turned palace strategy into public verdict. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered by the gates, and one woman gave voice to what many were thinking. "This feels like the future arriving early." That line moved quickly, because it said what the palace would not. Catherine's protected role was no longer hidden behind procedure. The reaction confirmed the emotional truth. Present power had been wounded. Future authority had been strengthened. And the balance between Camilla and Catherine had changed in a way no polished statement could reverse. And when the noise finally faded, one truth remained standing where Camilla's name had once been. In the end, the monarchy did not need to explain the removal because the meaning had already explained itself. Camilla's name vanished from Catherine's event list, and with it vanished the illusion that every royal role could still be balanced by politeness. This was not merely a scheduling change. It was a verdict about trust, future power, and Catherine's place at the center of what comes next. Catherine understood the weight of that verdict the moment the public reaction settled. She had not stepped forward to defeat Camilla, and she had not asked the palace to turn one event into a battlefield. Yet the result was impossible to soften. Her role had been separated from the queen consort's influence and protected as its own source of royal authority. Royal authority, in simple terms, means the power a figure carries, not only through title, but through trust, duty, and the public message attached to their presence. Catherine now carried that authority without needing another royal woman beside her to make it acceptable. Camilla absorbed the decision as a personal loss. She had missed more than one engagement. She had watched the palace prove it could move forward without her standing next to Catherine, and that was the part that wounded deepest. The queen consort knew symbolism. She knew that a removed name could speak as loudly as a palace announcement. She had once believed shared appearances could protect her place in the monarchy's emotional order. Now the same monarchy had shown that preserving appearances no longer mattered more than protecting Catherine's future. Charles felt the cost in a different way. The king understood that defending Camilla openly would have deepened the fracture, but accepting the decision quietly had wounded her all the same. He was left with the cruelest royal choice: protect his wife from humiliation, or protect the crown from confusion. The crown, plainly, is not just a person wearing a title. It is the institution of monarchy itself, the public system of duty, continuity, and national symbolism. Charles knew the system had chosen clarity, and that choice had left him standing between love and responsibility. William's quiet resolve became the force behind the entire moment. The prince did not need anger to draw a boundary. He only needed certainty. Catherine's composed appearance had given that certainty a human face. She did not gloat. She did not explain. She did not retreat. She carried the role with dignity, and that dignity became the emotional resolution of the story. The removal of Camilla's name marked the moment the monarchy chose clarity over comfort, Catherine's future over palace compromise, and quiet authority over fragile unity. Camilla lost proximity. Charles lost the illusion that silence could protect everyone. William gained a line he was willing to defend. Catherine gained the space to stand fully in her role. There was nothing left to add, because the empty space on that list had already said everything. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.